The air in the steakhouse was thick with cigar smoke and the low hum of conversation. For 9 years, that sound was a comfort. It was the sound of safety, of a past forgotten. He never saw the shadow that fell over Booth 4. In Harlem, loyalty wasn't a choice. It was the currency that kept the peace. It was the invisible thread connecting every corner store, every jazz club, every soul walking the avenue. Bumpy Johnson didn't just enforce this code, he embodied it. His word was collateral, and the men under his protection understood that their safety was guaranteed by one thing: absolute, unshakable trust. The man in question knew this better than anyone. He had stood close to the flame, warmed by the power that came with Bumpy's quiet nod. He'd eaten at his table, shared his whiskey, and listened as the gears of the empire turned. He was family, or as close as one could get without sharing blood. But greed is a patient poison. It whispers when a man is vulnerable, telling him that respect is not enough, that a king's shadow is still a shadow. A deal was made in a place Bumpy's eyes couldn't see. It wasn't about a lot of money. It was never just about the money. It was about principle. A line was crossed for a handful of silver, a betrayal that echoed louder than any gunshot. He didn't run. Running was for fools who thought they were being chased. Instead, he simply evaporated. One day, he was part of the landscape. The next, he was a ghost. He slipped out of Harlem like a whisper, confident that the city's noise would drown out his sin. He believed that 9 years was an eternity, long enough for any man to forget. He was wrong. Time, for some debts, doesn't pass. It waits. 9 years later, Harlem moved to a rhythm Bumpy Johnson had composed. It wasn't a place on a map. It was an ecosystem, and he was its center of gravity. From the early morning milk deliveries to the last note blown in a smoky after-hours club, every transaction, every greeting, every argument paid a silent tax to his authority. This wasn't the kind of power that needed a uniform or a badge. It was quieter, heavier. It was the power of presence. You could see it in the way he walked down 7th Avenue. He never hurried. The world seemed to part for him, not out of fear, but out of a deep, ingrained respect. A shopkeeper, sweeping his stoop, would stop and nod. Not a big, flashy greeting, just a slight dip of the head. Bumpy would return it with a glance, and in that silent exchange, a dozen things were understood. Business was good, the family was well, the neighborhood was quiet. His office wasn't a fortress. It was often just a table at a cafe or a bench in the park where he'd play chess. But wherever he sat, that space became the true seat of power in Harlem. People came to him with problems the police couldn't solve, or wouldn't. A landlord getting greedy, a young man getting reckless, a dispute between two numbers runners that threatened to turn bloody. Bumpy would listen. He'd hear both sides, his face unreadable, his gaze steady. He asked few questions, but they were the only ones that mattered. His judgment, when it came, was final. There were no appeals. There were no lawyers. There was only his word, and his word was the law that kept Harlem from tearing itself apart. He was the buffer between his community and the indifferent world outside. He provided a stability that no official institution ever could. This control wasn't maintained by force alone. It was earned. It was built on a foundation of promises kept and favors returned. It was built on the understanding that Bumpy's protection was absolute, so long as the rules were followed. And the first rule, the one written in stone, was loyalty. He remembered every face, every handshake, every promise. His mind was a ledger, perfectly balanced, where every debt was recorded and never, ever erased. The castle was his kingdom, and its walls were the memories of every man who lived within them. News in Harlem traveled like blood through a vein. It wasn't shouted from rooftops. It was a murmur in a barbershop, a name dropped in a numbers parlor, a story passed from a delivery man to a doorman. It was a living network, and its heart was Bumpy Johnson. Nothing moved, nothing breathed in his world without the vibration eventually reaching him. For 9 years, one name had been absent from this flow. It was a dead channel, a silent frequency. The whisper came on a Tuesday. It wasn't a formal report delivered by a subordinate. It was simpler, more organic. A man who ran errands for one of Bumpy's captains mentioned seeing a familiar face downtown, far from the familiar streets. He saw a ghost laughing, tipping a hat to a lady, paying for a meal with a crisp bill. The man looked comfortable, established, safe. The name was passed up the chain, not with urgency, but with the quiet gravity of a long dormant account suddenly coming due. The final word was delivered to Bumpy at his usual table at Wells' restaurant. He was stirring sugar into his coffee, the clinking of the spoon against porcelain the only sound in the small bubble of space he occupied. Junie Bird, his most trusted shadow, stood by the table waiting. He didn't speak until Bumpy looked up. "He's back," Junie said, his voice low. "Not in Harlem, but he's close, living fat down in the village, got a favorite spot, a steakhouse." Bumpy didn't respond. The spoon stopped moving. The silence that followed was heavier than any command. In that quiet, 9 years collapsed. The memory of the betrayal wasn't a hot flash of anger. It was a cold, clear fact, an entry in a ledger that had been left open. The man hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen a piece of the foundation. He had gambled that the structure would hold without it, that his absence would heal the crack. He gambled wrong. Bumpy finally lifted his gaze from the coffee cup. He looked at Junie, but his eyes were seeing something else. A face, a debt, a principle. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. No orders were spoken. No plan was laid out. None was needed. The decision was made, not in a moment of passion, but with the calm finality of a banker closing an account. The ghost had been found. Now, it was simply a matter of collection. The man who had been a ghost had built himself a new life, brick by brick, lie by lie. He had a new name, a new walk, a new history he could recite without blinking. His world was now one of clean handshakes and quiet investments, a world away from the coded language of the Harlem streets. He had traded a life of consequence for one of comfort, and he considered it the smartest deal he had ever made. The centerpiece of this new life, its most sacred ritual, was Tuesday dinner at Delmonico's. His routine was a suit of armor. At precisely 7 o'clock, he would leave his modest but respectable apartment. The doorman, a man named Michael, would tip his cap. "Evening, Mr. Wallace," he'd say. The ghost would nod back, the name feeling as natural as his own skin. He never took a cab. The 10-block walk was part of the process. It was a victory lap he took 3 times a week, a reminder of the distance he'd put between then and now. Delmonico's was an institution of old money and older rules. The maitre d' greeted him with a familiar, practiced warmth. "Mr. Wallace?" Your table is ready. It was always ready. It was always Booth 4. Booth 4 was a sanctuary within a sanctuary. Tucked into a back corner, its dark red leather upholstery felt like a throne. From there, he had a clear view of the entire dining room, the bar, the entrance. He could see everyone, but the shadows and the angle made him feel invisible. In his old life, a position like this was a tactical necessity. Here, it was a luxury. It gave him the illusion of control, the same feeling a man gets when watching fish in a tank. He was the observer, serene and detached, while the world swam on the other side of the glass. He ordered the same meal every time. A dry martini to start, followed by the Delmonico steak, medium rare. He didn't need to see a menu. The consistency was the point. It was proof that his life was now orderly, predictable, safe. But tonight, the rhythm was off. It was a subtle thing, a change in air pressure that only a man who had lived on his nerves should have felt. He didn't. The usual waiter, a balding man named Sal who knew his order by heart, was gone. A younger man with nervous eyes and hands that trembled just slightly took his place. "Sal is unwell this evening," the boy stammered, spilling a drop of water on the white linen. The ghost just waved a dismissive hand, feeling generous. At the bar, two men stood nursing glasses of whiskey. They didn't fit. They weren't Wall Street traders celebrating a win or tourists soaking in the history. They were still, their posture too relaxed, their eyes too patient. They were watching the room, but their gaze never landed on Booth 4. It didn't have to. Their presence was enough. They were a note played in a key that didn't belong in the song. The man in the booth saw none of it. He was insulated by his own success. He savored his steak, the sharp knife slicing through the tender meat. He read his newspaper, the ink staining his fingertips. He was so convinced of his safety, so wrapped in the comfort of the world he had built, that he had forgotten the first rule of his old one. A cage, no matter how gilded, is still a cage. And the most dangerous traps are the ones you build for yourself. He finished his meal, leaned back into the leather, and signaled for the check. A king in a castle whose walls were about to disappear. The check arrived on a small silver tray. The ghost, now fully inhabiting the comfortable skin of Mr. Wallace, reached for his fountain pen. Signing the bill was the final act of his weekly ritual, a flourish that affirmed his status. He was a man who belonged, a man who paid his way. A shadow fell over the table. He looked up, expecting the young waiter to be hovering, eager for his tip. But this was not the waiter. The man standing there was built like a dock worker, but he wore a tailored suit that didn't seem to notice his size. His face was a mask of polite indifference. He wasn't looking at Mr. Wallace. He was looking at the man from 9 years ago. In that instant, the comfortable booth became a cage. The 9 years of safety, the new name, the quiet life, it all evaporated. He was no longer Mr. Wallace. He was a traitor, and his past had just sat down across from him. He opened his mouth, but what could he say? An apology? A bribe? His throat was dry. The man across the table simply watched him, letting the silence do the work. The entire bustling restaurant seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in a pocket of cold reality. Then, a second man appeared. It was Junie Bird. He didn't approach the table. He simply stood a few feet away, a silent observer making sure the proceedings were not interrupted. The first man finally leaned forward, his voice a low rumble that didn't carry past the booth. "Bumpy sends his regards," he said. It wasn't a threat. It was a closing statement. The ghost's eyes darted from the man to Junie, then back again. He saw no anger, no emotion at all, only finality. He started to push himself up, a desperate animal instinct to flee kicking in too late. The man's hand moved. It wasn't fast, but it was fluid, a motion of absolute certainty. There was a single silver flash under the dim lights of the steakhouse, a blade, appearing and disappearing in the same heartbeat. The ghost froze, halfway out of his seat. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. He sank back into the red leather, his hand coming up to touch his chest. When he pulled it away, his fingers were stained dark. The knife was never seen again. The man stood, adjusted his tie, and turned. Junie was already moving toward the exit. Together they walked out For of a full minute, Delmonico's, no one in leaving behind a Delmonico's silent moved. dining room, the clinking of half-signed silverware, check, and a murmur of 9-year-old conversation, finally the distant paid in city full. sounds. All were swallowed by a thick, heavy silence. Patrons who had seen the two men leave didn't turn to follow them. They simply stared at their plates. The maitre d' stood frozen by his podium, his book of reservations forgotten. Even the young, nervous waiter stayed hidden in the kitchen. This wasn't the aftermath of a crime. It was the aftermath of a verdict. There were no shouts for police, no panicked rush for the doors. To call for help would be to admit you didn't understand what you had just witnessed. It was an internal affair, settled by a code that had no jurisdiction here, yet superseded all others. The message was clear. Bumpy Johnson's memory was longer than any street in New York, and his reach did not end at the Harlem River. By morning, the story had traveled from the polished floors of Delmonico's to the cracked pavement of Lenox Avenue. It wasn't in the papers. It was in the air. The numbers runner heard it from the baker. The bartender heard it from the cop on the beat, who had heard it from a doorman who knew a waiter. The name Wallace was never mentioned. The details of the blade were left to the imagination. All that was said was, they found him. Everyone knew who they were, and everyone knew who him was. The story of Booth 4 became a new chapter in the unwritten book of Harlem law. It wasn't a tale of violence. It was a lesson in accountability. It served as a quiet, chilling reminder that loyalty was not a temporary contract, but a permanent principle. A man's word was his bond, and breaking it started a clock that could run for 9 years or 90. In the end, the clock would always run out. Bumpy Johnson didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to make a threat. He simply had to wait. The silence that followed the flash of steel was louder than any gunshot, and its echo would ensure order for years to come.